Seb and Blessing sat in the living room. The warm glow of a lamp flickered over the table, where remnants of pounded yam and fisherman's soup lingered. The air was thick with the scent of seafood and red wine. Seb leaned back against the sofa, his face relaxed after the meal, a half-empty glass of wine in his hand. Blessing, seated beside him, observed him closely, her fingers trailing absent-mindedly over the rim of her own glass. She had waited for this moment, the perfect time to plant the seed of her ambition. She shifted slightly, brushing her fingers along his thigh with calculated tenderness. Her voice was smooth, persuasive. "That woman, Mrs. Igala, you know, in Abuja, she's well connected, I hear. These days in this country, if you are willing, she could find favor with you. It's a very good opportunity that other people are really looking for." Seb exhaled, taking a slow sip of his wine. His brow furrowed slightly. "Sure they are?" "I want to keep myself to myself, Blessing," he said, his tone measured, distant. The wine bottle rested on the glass table. The dimly lit room casted soft shadows around them. Blessing's hand tightened around her glass before she set it down deliberately. She leaned in closer, her perfume mixing with the scent of red wine, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But if you get closer to her, party with the correct people, it will help you," she murmured, slipping her arm around his shoulder. Her other hand found the wine bottle, pouring more into his glass before he could refuse. Seb shook his head slightly, the weariness in his expression clear. He hated the world Blessing wanted him to step into. The politics, the backstabbing, the fake smiles. He had taken an oath to heal, not to play power games. But she wouldn't let it go. Blessing's voice was honeyed but insistent, her fingers tapping against his knee as she tried to break his resolve. "Mrs. Igala can even press the right buttons for you, and who knows? Anything is possible in this country. She can find you something, even a ministerial post perhaps." Seb let out a low sigh, setting his glass down with a soft clink. His jaw tightened as he looked at her, his eyes dark with something between frustration and resignation. Blessing could feel it. He was slipping from her grasp, his principles holding firm. But she wasn't done. She had fought for this life, and she would fight harder to keep it. Seb had to see that. He had to see that her dreams were now their dreams. The night was far from over. The soft hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound as Blessing sat on the edge of the sofa, watching Seb, who was deep in thought. It had been a suggestion, spoken lightly, almost casually, but it was more than that. It was a plea, a challenge, a desperate push toward what she saw as reality. Blessing studied Seb's face, searching for any sign that he was finally seeing things her way. If only he could understand that the country was no longer the same as when he left for England. If only he could accept the truth. "Things are different now, Seb. You just have to move with the times," she said, her voice laced with urgency. But he remained silent, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest, his gaze distant. Blessing exhaled sharply as she placed the wine glass on the table. "Everyone in the country is in a hurry, everyone chasing something." Seb was the only one who seemed stuck, refusing to run in the same direction as everyone else. Who wouldn't want to be a millionaire, or even a billionaire? She muttered under her breath. Money was all that mattered now. Dreams, integrity, these were for those who didn't know how to play the game. She thought of Jacinta. How did she and her honorable rise so quickly? Just the other day, They had lived in a two-bedroom flat, driving that battered beetle car. Now look at them. A mansion, luxury cars, lavish parties. Anything was possible in this country, if only Seb would wake up and see it. In the bedroom, Blessing sat at the dresser, her reflection staring back at her. Her mind raced with thoughts. She closed her eyes, pushing away the bitter thought that haunted her. Unless, of course, Seb didn't love her enough to change. No, that couldn't be it. Seb was a man, and she had not yet met one she could not bend. It might take time, but she knew he would eventually yield. She had seen it happen too many times before. Why should he be different? She reached for her jewelry box, picking up a pair of gold earrings. Expensive things, beautiful things. Why couldn't they have them too? Why can't we drive expensive cars, live in a mansion, send our children to the best schools and throw lavish parties? She whispered. Wasn't that what every woman wanted for her man? She needed to convince herself. She needed to believe she was doing this for both of them. Only then could she quiet the doubt gnawing at the edge of her conscience. In living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls, Seb and Blessing sat close, their fingers intertwined, their eyes locked in an unspoken conversation. Seb studied her face, beautiful, radiant, almost ethereal, just like the first time they met. Back then, he had likened her to a darker-skinned Cleopatra, a woman of allure and mystery. She smiled at him, her lips curving in a way that still made his heart skip a beat. But now, he understood what lay beneath that smile. It wasn't just charm or sweetness. It was hunger, a relentless craving for wealth and privilege. Without them, her world had no meaning. He exhaled deeply, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the veins on her wrist. Tension thickened the air. Seb took another breath before speaking, his voice low but firm. I won't go to Mrs. Igala. He paused, watching her carefully. Certainly not for the reason you want me to. I'm being honest here. For a moment, silence settled between them like a wall. Then, as if struck by lightning, Blessing yanked her hand from his grasp. The sweet, alluring woman from moments ago vanished, replaced by someone sharp, someone wounded yet furious. Her movements were deliberate. She gathered the magazines from the center table with swift, forceful hands, each motion laced with anger. Without another word, she turned on her heels and stormed toward the bedroom, leaving Seb alone in the suffocating quiet. It was a Saturday at a lavishly decorated banquet hall in the prestigious Oriental Hotel, filled with elegantly dressed guests, laughter, and the rhythmic sounds of a live band. The party was in full swing. The golden glow of chandeliers bathed the hall, casting shimmering reflections on the polished marble floors. Mrs. Akabundu's 50th birthday was a grand affair, and Blessing took it all in with quiet admiration as she sipped her wine. She recognized most of the guests, doctors, administrators, and even top officials from the Ministry of Health, all mingling effortlessly. The Iguacha Health Center had its own reserved table, and Seb, being the doctor in charge, was seated at the head. The designation made Blessing feel important, as though she too was part of something exclusive. The air buzzed with conversations and laughter, the kind that spoke of connections, influence, and money. Blessing couldn't help but imagine the day when she would be the one in the spotlight, the center of admiration and envy. After greeting Mrs. Akobundu and wishing her a happy birthday, Blessing found herself lost in thought. She watched the matron move gracefully through the crowd, a woman who had everything: status, wealth, and a husband who adored her enough to throw such a lavish party. Would Seb do the same for her? Of course he would, she reassured herself. But first, the wedding had to come. A wedding fit for a doctor of his standing. A society wedding that would be the talk of the town. She imagined herself in an extravagant white gown, the admiration of the city's elite, the kind of wedding people would whisper about for months. She took another sip of her wine, letting the vision take hold. This was just the beginning. 6 months. That's how long Mrs. Akobundu had been preparing for this day. Blessing had heard her talk about it at work almost every day. It wasn't just her effort, though. Her husband had insisted on throwing the party, sparing no expense. A business associate of his had even paid for the live band as a gift. It was all so perfect, so well orchestrated. Blessing smiled to herself. If this was how things were done, then when her own day came, when it was her wedding, she would make sure Seb understood just how important it was. No expense would be spared. No detail would be overlooked. This was how people of status celebrated, and she was meant to be one of them. Laughter and conversation filled the air, mingling with the rhythmic beat of the music blasting from the speakers. Guests were in high spirits, enjoying plates filled with an assortment of delicacies from the lavish buffet. Glasses clinked as drinks flowed freely. On the dance floor, a few guests had already lost themselves to the infectious beats, their movements uninhibited. At the high table, Mrs. Akobundu leaned in to whisper something to her husband before quickly pulling him toward Chief Akisi, the chairman of the Igovia Chamber of Commerce. Their conversation was hushed, but there was a shift in the air, a quiet anticipation. The atmosphere changed subtly as Chief Akobundu moved swiftly to the master of ceremony. His instructions were clear. The music must be lowered and the arrival must be announced properly. The band shifted to a softer, more ceremonial tune. The MC's voice boomed over the microphone, commanding immediate attention. We recognize the arrival and presence of Madame Honorable, Lady Jacinta Ikeka, the wife of the Honorable Member of the House of Assembly. A ripple of movement swept through the hall. Heads snapped toward the entrance. Conversations halted. Guests rose from their seats in acknowledgement, their eyes fixed on the woman stepping inside. Jacinta entered, exuding an aura of confidence and prestige. She moved with grace, each step measured, each movement deliberate. Flanking her were Chief and Mrs. Akobundu, personally escorting her to the high table. Behind her, a retinue of elegantly dressed women, including her personal assistants, followed in perfect formation. She was stunning. Draped in a luxurious purple Saint Laurent trouser suit, a rare import from Paris arranged by Ibier, she was a vision of wealth and power. Her personal assistant carried her gold-plated handbag with care, handing it over once Jacinta was seated. The golden jewelry adorning her neck and wrists caught the light, making her glow with an almost ethereal radiance. No one was surprised by her extravagance. She was, after all, the epitome of the perfect legislator's wife, affluent, stylish, and unapologetically grand. The hall buzzed with excitement as the MC took to the microphone again, his voice rising above the chatter. He was eager to announce that she had just returned from abroad, where she had been holidaying. "You are welcome, madam. We celebrate you and your husband, the honorable member. God bless you, ma." Jacinta just nodded her well-practiced smile that did not reach her ears. Yet, beneath the practiced smile, her face remained unreadable, almost indifferent. As much as Blessing was grateful that Jacinta had remained her friend, Blessing's covetous nature made her so resentful. Sitting stiffly at her table, Blessing sipped her wine, watching Jacinta with a mixture of admiration and bitter envy. The applause, the admiration, the effortless way Jacinta commanded attention, it all burned her inside. How did she get so lucky? She thought. From the moment Jacinta's husband became an honorable member, Blessing had bad-mouthed them to anyone who would listen. She told stories, speculated, and even convinced herself that Chris had joined a secret fraternity to rise so fast. But deep down, she knew the truth. Jacinta had everything she wanted, everything she had dreamed of for herself, and she did not want to be reminded of that. Seb leaned back in his chair, casually telling some long-winded story about how he almost froze to death in his first winter in England. He chuckled, sipping his drink, oblivious to the storm brewing in Blessing's mind. She barely heard a word he was saying, her hands clenched into fists under the table. How can he be so content, so blind? The humiliation of still being unseen, of still not arriving in society's eyes, was unbearable. Every time she looked at Jacinta, dressed in wealth, embraced by power, it felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She had tried to push Seb towards powerful connections, towards Mrs. Igala, towards a future that would place her where she belonged. But he refused to play the game. Seb is a lost cause. A sudden fierce determination settled over her. If Seb refused to move forward, she would have to make things happen herself. She couldn't stand to be a nobody any longer. She had wasted enough time waiting for him to change. Watching Jacinta being celebrated tonight had solidified it for her. This life of mediocrity was not for her. I won't let this be my story. She set down her wine glass with a decisive clink against the table. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. She was done waiting. It was time to act.